government for inviting the Democratic Labour Party to this important initial conversation. As I said in there, I think this is just the start and we need to have more serious and detailed conversations. We obviously have to see the full report to get the details of what the options are that are available for the government. There's been no indication of which of the options the government is likely or more or less likely to choose. And I await that full report. We'll take that back to our membership and then we will be able to give more considered input into the reform of the national insurance scheme. I just want to say initially though, and these are some of our initial thoughts, the reality is I think we're going to have that radical reform, and we hope the government has the appetite for that, because the reality is that the reform is not about now, the reform is about future generations. It's basically for my kids, for your kids, for persons watching at home, their grandkids. So we look forward to seeing what is offered, but we're making it clear the position of the Democratic Labour Party is that there has to be serious discussions and consultations. This cannot be a theatre, and we are willing to engage and work with all parties who are obviously looking to do the best for Barbadians when it comes to pension reform.
The Prime Minister mentioned that there will be a 3-week window in which these discussions are likely to take place. Do you think that is sufficient time?
I don't think that would be sufficient time, given the fact that we've been made available a presentation, and we still have to see the full report. I understand that report was laid in Parliament, if I'm not mistaken, last night, and we would still be awaiting the details of that report. It is one thing to have initial thoughts and conversations on the presentation. We understand the dire state of the fund. We understand what will happen if there's no reform, but it will be another thing to respond to the details of that report, and that will require some time. Obviously, we want the process to be done properly, and I think we'll definitely need more than the 3 weeks as a country to really engage with this from the perspective of the unions, the political parties, and the private sector. It was very interesting that I think the private sector made a point that this is supposed to be a one-off reform, and I have to disagree with that. The reality is we have to build in reform within the NIS constantly. This is not a one-off. This is, this reform and this process of where we are will happen again at another point. The issue or the thing is, how do we respond to it? And that's where we're going to have to decide now. And I think now we should build in response mechanisms to the reform of our pension scheme over for the next 25 years, another 25 and another 25, so that the next generation is not caught off guard with these reforms. When Alvaro and the Democratic Labour Party first established the national insurance scheme, they could have never imagined how Barbados would be now. But we recognize that the scheme was successful because there are a generation of Barbadians, and let us be realistic about that do not require the national insurance scheme. So we're going to have to look at the concepts of universality. Do we pay everyone out of the scheme? Does everyone really require the scheme? And maybe we have to start thinking about optionalities and opt-outs. And then how does that affect the scheme? Does that affect businesses? Does that affect persons paying in? And then how do we create a private market so that persons, at least a wider private market with more players, can save for their retirement? The reality is that this party would want to protect those, what we call a persistent pool at the lower end, who will require a national insurance support scheme, but it also wants to set free that higher end and that middle end who may not require the scheme to be able to pursue their own savings and their own retirement programs. And the other thing we have to consider, do we shift the scheme from focusing on retirement? If it's one thing COVID has shown us, is actually unemployment benefits and sickness benefits may be the issue of the future. We're living longer, we're not going to retire. None of you guys are probably going to retire in the way that our grandparents retired. We're probably going to work less as we get older. So therefore, if that's the case, do we focus on retirement funds per se, or do we focus on unemployment and sickness, given sometimes we may be involved in gig work or we change jobs regularly, so there may be periods when you're not working. And if COVID has shown us anything, maybe we have to change the risk of what the NIS is trying to do. Not focus so much on retirement, but unemployment, sickness, and the other parts of our changing nature of work. So when we have to look at this, there are a lot of things to consider, and I would hope that all the parties are really thinking seriously about these things, especially as it comes to how work is changing and what the fund is designed for. When the fund was first designed, it was designed for a 9-to-5 job. retired at 60, you went home, you knitted, I don't know, tended the garden, took care of your grandkids, you passed away peacefully with surrounded by your children. Now we're living to 80, you're overlapping sometimes with your kids reaching into their 50s and their 60s, 2 generations of older people. These are the kind of problems that we face. So the fund has to decide what type of fund it is. I think optionality and opt-outs are some of the things that we had to consider, and the fact that maybe we need to move away from this universal one-size-fits NIS for everybody. It may not work. We have to think about scales and gradations and all of these things. And I'm not sure and I'm not convinced maybe that that's where the government is, but I think that's where, as a party, we are trying to think, let's think futuristic, and if we're going to open this this fund for reform, let's do it. There's no point of any half reform. We cannot afford half reforms at this particular point in time. So any reform and anything that I see from the government's end, we want something that's big, bold, and something that puts Barbados and sets us up for the future.